They say the mountains speak, if only you're quiet enough to listen. And for some, like David Reynolds, the call of the wild has never been silent. David was 67, a retired wildlife biologist living on the edge of the Colorado Rockies. His days were now filled with coffee at dawn, old journals piled high by the window, and long walks along a creek that sang of younger days. His hands were lined with stories of bears tagged, eagles rescued, wolves tracked across snowy ridges. But his heart, it still stirred when the wind came down from the mountains. John Muir, the great American conservationist, once wrote, "In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks." David knew this truth better than most. To him, the forest was never just trees. The mountains were never just stone. They were a cathedral of life, a sacred space where he had found purpose, wonder, and sometimes even redemption. But time has a way of making even the wildest hearts quiet. For years, David had told himself he'd done enough, that the young generation of conservationists could carry the torch, that his work was finished. Until one November afternoon, the phone rang. "David," came the voice on the line, thin with static. "We've spotted a lynx up near Eagle Pass. Injured. Looks bad. We could use your help." In that instant, the years fell away. David felt his pulse quicken, the old instinct rising. The mountains, it seemed, were calling once more. John Muir's other famous words echoed in his mind. "The mountains are calling, and I must go." David glanced out the window at the peaks carved against the pale winter sky. He knew this wasn't just about an injured animal. It was about answering a deeper call, one that had shaped his life, his soul, his very reason for being. As he pulled on his worn leather boots and shrugged into his old parka, David felt a quiet fire kindle in his chest. It wasn't just the thrill of the rescue. It was the pull of something bigger, the wild itself, reaching out one more time. Somewhere up there, in the fading light of a November afternoon, an animal waited. And without hesitation, David answered. Because for some, the mountains don't just call, they sing. And a man like David, he was born to listen. The road curled away from David's cabin like a silver ribbon, winding into the heart of the mountains. As his old truck rumbled along the narrow highway, David watched the world shift outside his window. The golden glow of late autumn gave way to deepening shadows, pine trees dusted with early snow, and the first icy fingers of winter crawling over the land. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. The dashboard light flickered softly, casting shadows over the creases of his weathered face. It had been years since David had gone this far into the backcountry alone. His daughter Emily had called twice after he left. Her worried voice still echoed in his mind. "Dad, please. Let the younger team handle this." But David knew. There were things you didn't pass on, things you carried to the end. He reached over, fingers brushing the worn map with its faded pencil marks. Old migration routes, watering holes, dens he'd marked over a lifetime of work. Every inch of this wilderness told a story. Every trail held a memory. The mountains are calling, and I must go. Those words whispered to him like a prayer. Halfway up Eagle Pass, the road narrowed, hugging the cliffs as if reluctant to let anyone through. The wind picked up, sending flurries of snow across the windshield. David eased his truck into four-wheel drive, his breath misting the cab. Up ahead, the trailhead waited, and beyond that, somewhere in the gathering dark, an injured lynx. David stepped out into the cold, the sudden silence wrapping around him like an old coat. The air was sharp, filled with the clean scent of pine and distant snowfall. For a moment, he stood still, breathing it in. The kind of stillness that cities never know, the kind of silence that humbles you. Pulling on his pack, David felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. Not just gear, but history. He checked the radio. Static. No signal this high. With a quiet sigh, he slipped the radio into his pocket, adjusted his hat, and turned toward the trail. People think of wilderness as empty, but David knew better. Out here, every sound mattered. The distant crack of a branch, the flutter of wings, the hush of falling snow. He moved with the caution of a man who understood that he was a guest, not a master. As the sun slipped behind the ridge, the temperature dropped fast. David's breath came in short clouds. His knees ached. His heart thudded against his ribs. But inside there was something fierce, something alive. Emily had asked why he still did this. He'd only said, "Because it matters." But the truth was simpler. Because it's who he was. Halfway up the pass, the trees thinned, and David paused. From here, the valley stretched out below, a sea of white and shadow. Somewhere in that vastness, a life hung in the balance. David closed his eyes, felt the wind on his face, and listened. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard it. Not just the wind, not just the wild, but the call that had always been there. By the time David reached the ridgeline, the sun had disappeared behind the mountains, leaving a pale, bruised sky. Night fell fast in the Rockies. What was once a golden trail bathed in autumn light now became a narrow, uncertain path of ice and shadow. He paused for a moment, catching his breath, his hands resting on his knees. His legs ached, a sharp reminder of years no amount of stubbornness could erase. The air here was thinner, colder, sharper. His fingers, even through the gloves, were stiff and slow, but his eyes remained sharp. David pulled the radio from his coat, thumbed the worn button. "Base, this is David. Do you copy?" Nothing but static. He tried again. Still nothing. He slipped it back into his pocket, glanced up at the ridge, and quietly smiled to himself. Just like the old days. The trail narrowed to a ledge barely wider than his boots. Below, the land fell away sharply, a sweep of pine, rock, and snow, disappearing into a dark valley. One wrong step, and it was a long fall into silence. But David moved forward, slow, deliberate, careful as a man crossing memory itself. Halfway across the ledge, the wind struck, fierce and wild, as if the mountain itself were testing him. David stumbled, heart leaping into his throat, one hand shooting out to steady himself against the frozen rock wall. For a breathless moment, he stood frozen, the world narrowing to the sound of his heartbeat and the howl of the wind. "Easy, old man," he murmured to himself, his voice half laugh, half warning. He steadied his breath, planted his stick, and moved on. As the trail widened again, David saw them, faint tracks in the snow, Lynx tracks. He knelt, fingers brushing over the delicate paw prints, the drag of an injured leg trailing behind. His heart lifted just for a moment. The animal was close, but then a realization settled like a stone in his gut. These tracks were fresh, very fresh. David looked up. The sky was no longer just dark, it was heavy, churning, the first flakes of a rising storm swirling around him. He knew these mountains, knew how fast a storm could roll in, how quickly a clear night could turn to blinding snow and bitter wind. And he knew, if he didn't reach the Lynx soon, neither of them might make it out. He pushed on, faster now, his breath rasping, his knees protesting every step. The snow deepened. The trees thickened. Somewhere just beyond the next rise, he sensed it. The shape of a life, crouched low, waiting. Then he saw it. A flash of pale fur beneath a fallen pine. The lynx. It was smaller than he expected, its leg twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide with pain and fear. For a moment, man and animal locked eyes. Two creatures caught between survival and surrender. "Hey there, beauty," David murmured, crouching low, voice gentle as snowfall. "Easy now. You're not alone." He pulled a blanket from his pack, moving slowly, every motion measured. The lynx let out a low, warning growl, but it was weak, exhaustion in every sound. David's fingers trembled as he wrapped the animal, feeling its heart thudding rapid fire beneath its ribs. Years ago, David had held wolves, foxes, eagles. Each time he marveled at the fierce, wild pulse of life. Tonight, as the first sharp flake stung his cheeks, he felt that same wonder. But also, the weight of time. He was not the young man he had been. And ahead of him waited not only the storm, but the long, treacherous journey home. He tried the radio again. Static. Nothing. His truck was nearly 2 miles below. The ledge trail was no longer safe. He would have to carry the Lynx through the storm, on foot. David tightened the blanket, adjusted his pack, and lifted the Lynx into his arms. The weight was not much, but combined with the terrain, the cold, the storm, it was everything. Step by step, David moved forward, his breath raw in his throat, the cold gnawing at his fingers. Every few feet he paused, not from weakness but calculation, testing the snow, listening for the shift of ice, feeling the mountain. As night swallowed the ridge, the storm broke open, blinding, relentless, alive with fury. But somewhere in that storm, beneath the roar of the wind and the crack of the trees, David found his rhythm. Old strength stirred, old instincts awoke, and with every aching step, one truth pulsed through his mind. In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. Hours blurred into each other as David trudged through the storm. The snow swallowed his footprints almost as soon as they were made, erasing every trace of his passage, as though the mountain wanted to remind him, out here, you are small. His arms ached from cradling the Lynx, the blanket slowly stiffening with ice. Each step was a battle, his boots sinking into snowdrifts that reached his knees. His breath rasped, his chest tight with effort, the cold gnawing at the edges of his strength. But still, forward. Halfway down the slope, the world shifted beneath him. A hidden patch of ice, a sudden slide. David's foot shot out, the ground vanished from under him, and for one heart-stopping instant, he was airborne. He landed hard, the breath punched from his lungs. The Lynx tumbled from his arms, the blanket unraveling in the snow. For a moment, everything was still. Just the wild beat of his heart and the soft whimper of the injured animal. David forced himself up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his knee. He tested it. It held, but barely. He limped to the Lynx, gathering it back into his arms with shaking hands. The animal trembled, its wide gold eyes fixed on his. And in that look, something shifted. This was no longer just a rescue. This was a test. For the first time in years, David felt the raw edge of his own limits, the weight of age, the brittleness of his body. Am I enough? He wondered. Can I still do this? He pulled out the radio, thumb trembling on the button. Base, this is David Reynolds. If you can hear me, I have the Lynx. I'm on the east slope, past Eagle Pass. I need static. Then, a voice, faint, breaking. David, we read you. Stay put, we're coming. For the first time that night, David allowed himself a breath of hope. Help was coming, but he knew better than to wait still. The storm could turn again. The trail could vanish. The cold was a patient hunter. He wrapped the Lynx more securely, tightened his pack and limped forward, following the faint glow of his headlamp cutting through the snow. Each step was an act of defiance. Each breath a quiet promise. I will not give up. David's mind drifted, not from weakness, but memory. He thought of the first wolf he'd ever collared in these mountains, of the time he'd climbed a frozen slope to free an eagle tangled in fishing line, of Emily as a little girl, riding on his shoulders, laughing as the wind whipped through her hair. These were the things that kept him moving. Then, through the swirl of snow, a flicker. Headlights, distant but unmistakable. David stopped, his breath hitching in his chest. A laugh, rough, broken, but full of life, escaped his lips. The young wildlife officer had found him. As the figure approached, bundled against the cold, David felt something loosen in his chest. Not just relief, but something deeper. He had done what he came to do. And nature, fierce, untamed, beautiful nature, had once again reminded him, even at the edge of strength, there is still purpose. There is still connection. There is still wildness worth saving. The headlights flickered like a promise through the storm, a fragile ribbon of light in a world gone white. David's knees buckled, the weight of the Lynx pressing into his chest, the ache in his legs and back surging forward like a tidal wave. He took a breath, and another. Then, gritting his teeth, he pressed on. Snow lashed his face, sharp as needles. His gloves were soaked, his fingers numb. He couldn't tell if his cheeks were wet with melted snow or with tears. His body was screaming to stop, but his heart, the stubborn heart of a man who had given his life to the wild, beat louder. Somewhere deep in his mind, a memory surfaced. Emily, no more than 6 years old, wrapped in a puffy red jacket, cheeks flushed, reaching her arms up to him at the trailhead. "Daddy, can we save them all?" she'd asked. He had smiled then, a tired, knowing smile, and said, "We can try, sweetheart. We can always try." "David, can you hear us?" The young officer's voice crackled faintly. David fumbled for the radio. "Yeah, I hear you. I see the lights. I'm coming down." But the mountain was not done testing him. As David limped toward the headlights, the slope beneath his feet gave a warning groan, the low, guttural sound of shifting earth and snow. He froze. Avalanche? No, not yet. But the storm had softened the ground, and every step now was a gamble. David's eyes darted across the slope. There, to the right, a stand of old pines, their roots anchoring the earth. If he could make it there, the ground might hold. He shifted the Lynx in his arms, cradling its fragile body closer, and turned toward the trees, step by step, one foot, then the other. But the mountain had one more trick. David stumbled as the ground tilted beneath him, the world jerking sideways. He threw himself forward, crashing into the trees just as a sheet of snow roared down the slope, a white river of ice and fury. For a heartbeat, everything was still. David lay half-buried, the Lynx shielded under his body, his face pressed into the cold earth. He was shaking, from cold, from adrenaline, from the sheer nearness of disaster. But when he lifted his head, he was still here, voice thick with emotion. Above him, the headlights pierced the dark. A figure stumbled toward him, the young officer, face wrapped in a scarf, eyes wide with alarm. "David, are you okay?" David let out a breathless laugh. "Define okay," he rasped. The officer dropped to his knees beside him, helping lift the Lynx, checking David's arms and legs for brakes. "We've got you. We've got both of you. Come on, let's get you out of here." As they moved, David leaned heavily on the officer, his body near collapse, but his heart strangely light. He had come to the mountain not just for a rescue, but for a reckoning, a confrontation with his own limits. And here, on the ragged edge of strength, he had found something he hadn't expected, not the end of his journey, but its renewal. Inside the warmth of the rescue truck, David sank into the seat, eyes closed, fingers thawing. The young officer pressed a cup of coffee into his hands, shaking his head in quiet awe. "You're a legend, you know that?" David smiled faintly. "Just stubborn?" Outside the window, the storm still howled, but inside the truck, there was heat, there was light, and there was the quiet, steady pulse of a life saved. David leaned his head back, listening to the soft breathing of the Lynx in the carrier behind him. And in that moment, John Muir's words stirred once again in his mind. In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. The storm was fading. The world outside the truck transformed into a quiet, snow-blanketed wilderness, glistening under a sliver of moonlight. Inside, David sat slumped against the seat, the heat thawing the stiffness from his limbs, the rich scent of coffee filling the cab. The young officer, Alex, glanced over at him, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Alex, you really weren't going to wait for backup, were you? David, when the mountains call, you don't wait." David closed his eyes, letting exhaustion seep through his bones. But then, a soft nudge at his arm. Alex held out a phone. "Alex, someone wants to talk to you." "David." "Hello?" "Emily." "Dad? It's Emily." For a long moment, David couldn't speak. His throat tightened. He hadn't told Emily he was going into the mountains tonight, hadn't wanted to worry her, but somehow the news had reached her. "Emily? Dad, are you okay?" David swallowed hard. "David, I'm okay, sweetheart. A little frozen, a little bruised, but okay. Emily, you're unbelievable, you know that? Even now, you're still out there saving things." In that moment, something shifted in David's chest. All these years, he had feared that Emily never truly understood why he had given his life to the wild, why he had missed birthdays and anniversaries, why he had poured his heart into creatures most people never even saw. But here, across a crackling phone line, he heard something he'd never expected. Understanding, pride. "Emily, you're not done yet, are you?" David leaned his head back against the seat, a smile tugging at his lips. "David, no, not yet." And then, the real twist. Radio voice based to Alex. "We just got a report from hikers near Pine Ridge. They spotted another injured animal. A young wolf, caught in an old trap. Can you check it on your way back?" David opened his eyes, his body heavy with fatigue. Another rescue, another life in need. He glanced at Alex, who raised an eyebrow. "Alex, what do you think, David? Want to head home or?" David looked out the window, where the mountains waited. Silent, vast, timeless. Then he reached down, pressed his palm lightly against the Lynx carrier, feeling the faint rise and fall of its breath, and slowly, he smiled. Because the truth was this: the mountains never stop calling, and for some hearts, the ones stitched together by wilderness and wonder, there is no finish line, only the next step, the next life to save, the next story to carry home. David sat up, straightened his shoulders, and met Alex's gaze. "David, let's go. We've got work to do. We've got work to..." The truck rumbled down the narrow mountain road, headlights slicing through the dark. Inside, David sat in silence, watching the snowflakes dance past the window like tiny white embers. The Lynx lay curled in its carrier, its chest rising and falling in an exhausted, steady rhythm. Next to David, Alex adjusted the radio, giving quick updates to the base. But for David, the world had gone quiet. Not empty, but full, like the hush of a cathedral after the last bell has rung. Emily's voice still echoed in his mind. "You're not done yet, are you?" No, he wasn't. Not because he had something to prove, but because the wild had always been his church, his teacher, his lifelong companion. To walk away now would be to silence the very thing that had shaped him. By the time they reached Pine Ridge, the first pale light of dawn brushed the sky, turning the snow a soft shade of rose. And there, just as the report had said, they found the young wolf, its leg caught in a rusted old trap, eyes wide and frightened. David moved slowly, carefully, years of muscle memory guiding his hands. Alex watched, learning, not just the technique, but the tenderness, the respect, the quiet reverence David brought to every rescue. With the trap removed, the wolf limped briefly, then paused, looking back. For one long moment, man and animal locked eyes across the snowy clearing. Then, like a shadow melting into the trees, the wolf was gone. David stood there, breathless, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He felt no need to speak, no need to explain. Some moments are meant only to be felt. Back at the truck, Alex clapped him on the shoulder. "You're kind of a legend, you know." David gave a soft laugh, shaking his head. "I'm just a man who listens when the mountains call." On the drive home, David watched the landscape unfurl, the mountains bathed in gold, the trees heavy with snow, the world awakening once more. He thought of all he had lost, all he had found, of Emily waiting at home, of the lynx resting safely in the back, of the wolf now free in the trees. And he realized something simple, something profound. John Muir had been right all along. In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. David had gone into the mountains that night to save a life, but somewhere along the way, the mountains had saved something in him. They had reminded him that purpose does not end with age, that love for the wild is a lifelong flame, and that some calls are too deep to ignore. And as the road wound home, David felt it, not an ending, but a beginning. Because for those who hear the call of the wild, the journey is never over. It only changes its shape. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt the mountains call your name, share your thoughts below. And if you want to hear more stories of wonder, resilience, and the wild places we call home, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next adventure.